Students for Europe, and we have had there a collaboration between SPUI25 and ACES, so the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, and you are able to see the previous 4 sessions as videos on the website of ACES and of SPUI25. And we discussed issues such as the geopolitical orders and how they change under the pandemic, how the pandemic changed politics at the European or national level, the socioeconomic impact, and the impact on the organization of public health. So in this last session, we are turning to maybe the most fundamental question of whether the EU, and I will not say much more about this because our organizer, Jonathan Zeitlin, will first take the floor. He's Distinguished Faculty Professor of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Amsterdam and the ACES Academic Director. Our second speaker, truly an invited guest, is Professor of European Studies and International Political Economy at the Powell H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies of the Johns Hopkins University, and his particular interests are the European monetary integration and macroeconomic governance. Our third speaker, Frank van der Broeke, is closer to home, University Professor at the University of Amsterdam, and his research focus is on the impact of the EU on the development of social and employment policy in the EU member states. Finally, we have Teresa Kuhn, an Associate Professor of Political Science, also from the University of Amsterdam, and her focus is on transnational solidarity, a project that she's carrying out fully funded by the Dutch Science Organization. My name is Christina Eckes, and it is my pleasure to host today's session. And without much further ado, I will give the word to Jonathan Zeitlin.
Thank you, Christina. And just to remind people of the format, each of the speakers will make an opening statement of about 5 minutes. I'll take a little bit longer to set the stage. Then each of the speakers will have a couple of minutes to respond to the others. And then we will open out to you, the audience. You'll find at the bottom of your screen a Q&A window, and you can type your questions at any time. Christina will organize them and direct them to the other speakers. We will try to respond to all the questions, and we will run somewhere between an hour to a maximum of an hour and 15 minutes. So as Christina said, this is the last in our series. We've looked at different dimensions of the crisis, and what we want to do now is to reflect on what are the implications for the European Union and European integration. And as with most crises, we can expect that either it may have a positive propulsive effect on the EU, or it could also, however, launch important disintegrative tendencies, which are already to some extent visible in the situation. My colleagues, I think, are going to talk about different aspects of the urgency for different kinds of solidarity between member states and different groups within the EU in order to counteract these kinds of disintegrative tendencies, which are as much, let us say, political as they are socio-economic, and also to reflect on what are the prospects for such solidarity. What I want to do in the time I have available is to try to set the stage a little bit and to explain why the pandemic is in some sense a particularly existential challenge or crisis for the European Union. And I want to say, to put it simply, that the P of pandemic comes on top of 3 Ps that the European Union has already been struggling with over the past decade. And these I call a polycrisis, polycleavages, and a politics trap. And here I'm using some concepts which Francesco Nicoli and I developed in the introduction to a special issue of the Journal of European Public Policy that was circulated in advance for those who are interested. Polycrisis is a term that was coined by the previous Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker. It refers to the fact that the EU has faced a series of crises since the beginning of the global financial crisis, followed by the Euro crisis, followed by the refugee and migration crisis, and there are certainly other important challenges to the rule of law, also Brexit, whether you think they rise to the same kind of level. Now, we can say that these polycrises have also generated polycleavages, multiple cleavages. In the Euro crisis, predominantly a north-south cleavage. In the refugee and migration crisis, predominantly a cleavage between frontline member states and ones who do not have to defend or deal with the borders of the European Union. It's also, to some extent, an east-west cleavage. And that certainly is the case for the rule of law. And these multiple cleavages obviously make politics and decision-making much more difficult in the European Union. We can say as well that they help to trigger what Brigitte Lafont has called a politics trap. And this is an interaction between the politicization of European integration at the national level and the European level. And the issue here is that as European integration issues become more politicized at the national level, national leaders in Brussels, in European decision-making, feel themselves either increasingly constrained or increasingly sensitive to the demands of their domestic audience. And that makes compromises at the European level more difficult to strike. Now, this is particularly important for a couple of reasons. One is that this blocks what would be the natural solution to the polycleavage, which are various forms of package deals or grand bargains, which bring together or try to straddle the interests of different member states. We could imagine those. It's easy to see how that could happen in things like Eurozone reform with the combining risk sharing and risk reduction. And we could also imagine it in refugee and asylum policy between common control of the EU borders and flexible solidarity within the EU. But it's very difficult to make that happen when national leaders are narrowly defending their own interests in Brussels. And that is, of course, precisely the issue that we now find ourselves faced with, which is to say whether it will be possible, for example, around the pandemic recovery plan that that von der Leyen, as the president of the Commission, has proposed today, to bring together different member states with different interests and with different political constituencies and positioning around a positive way forward. I think that I have some things that I would like to say perhaps later about the role of leadership in working out of the politics crisis, politics trap, and what the prospects for that might be. But I think I will save that now for my second bite at the cherry later and turn the floor over to our guest, Erik Jones, who will underline the risks of disintegration for now.
Well, thanks a lot, Jonathan, and thank you all for allowing me to be here. When I accepted this invitation, I knew I wasn't coming to Amsterdam, but I'm hoping that at some point in the future you will bring me back up there, because it's always a great pleasure to visit. Look, I think this is the perfect time for us to talk about European disintegration, because the European Commission has just come out with a wonderful proposal that many of my colleagues, I think, is going to think is a revolutionary proposal to add extensively to the borrowing capacity of the European Commission, and perhaps also to the financial capacity of the European project as a whole. In this new proposal ensures, I think, in many ways that the recovery will be better financed than we had feared, and that European institutions will be more powerful than we had worried that they might emerge from this crisis being. And certainly the bond market reaction to this has been significant. Now, for the first time since the European Central Bank intervened in the markets, the spread between Italian and German sovereign debt has fallen below 2 percentage points or 200 basis points, and that's a very good sign. And it's precisely at moments like this when we need to think about what could go wrong. And the reason that we need to think about what could go wrong is because what we learned from the last crisis is that there's actually no moment where complacency is at all warranted, because the dynamics at work are so contradictory all the time. We get integration taking place at the same time disintegration is taking place. And if we don't pay attention to those disintegrative forces, then we're likely to face nasty surprises. Well, what do I mean here? Think about it just in very simple terms. What we've seen in this agreement is a really outstanding institutional innovation to allow the European Commission to borrow extensively against the backdrop of the multi-annual financial framework. And that institutional innovation looks a lot like integration, but we should be asking ourselves, okay, what are going to be the consequences of this policy? Because the consequences of this policy could be significantly inequitable across countries, or they could have implications that are second or third order that result in divergences emerging across countries. And so we have to be very cautious about that effect. Here, I think it's easier to point to an example of an earlier European Commission policy innovation, which was to relax the rules on state aid within the context of the competition policy. And what we saw is that on the one hand, this is a very effective measure to ensure that governments are able to inject capital directly into firms and crucially, directly into banks to stabilize the financial system. But on the other hand, it created an opportunity for a significant divergence to take place because, quite understandably, some governments have more resources to inject into the private sector than others, which gives them a significant competitive advantage emerging from the crisis. So what looks like a good policy innovation on the one hand has implications on the other hand that may not be good for the future of Europe. And we have to be very attentive to that potential for dichotomy. I think we also have to be attentive to that potential for dichotomy because of the way we structure a lot of these institutional arrangements. And here we can go back to the European Commission's proposal. One of the big question marks is to what extent getting access to the grants that will be made available along the lines and through the instruments of the multi-annual financial framework will be conditioned on the successful adherence to recommendations made by the European Commission within the context of the European semester. And that notion of conditionality is perceived very differently in some parts of Europe from other parts of Europe. There are some parts of Europe that look at conditionality as a qualification obligation. This is something you need to do in order to gain access to certain facilities. In other parts of Europe, it looked at as a form of discrimination. First, you must overcome this hurdle, and then you will be allowed to get access to the resources. And to give you a sense of what I mean, just think about the strength of the debate about the European stability mechanism that took place in Italy, not during this crisis, but immediately prior to this crisis, when they were trying to ratify certain treaty innovations that had been agreed already by the government that was in power in the spring of 2019. And what we saw is that it almost collapsed the new government that formed in August of 2019. It almost collapsed that government because some parts of the government that belonged to the old government that it replaced, some parts of that government simply could not accept the conditionality that was implied. Why is this important? It's important because to get from now to the new funds that are going to be made available by the European Commission, Italy is very likely to have to go to the European Stability Mechanism to access resources that have been made available. But accessing those resources would imply even a very light level of conditionality, which they perceive as disintegration or discrimination. And when I say that, all the positive things that are going on have a negative dimension that needs to be managed, and that's all I would emphasize. Thanks a lot, Christina, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Christina and Jonathan, for having me here. I very much agree with Erik Jones that it may well be the case that we witness more collective action or more readiness to organize collective action at EU level in some dimensions of policy, and thus more integration in some dimensions, whilst in other dimensions, we may be witnessing less readiness for collective action, and so forces of disintegration. And in a piece that Erik published on this, and which I found very interesting, he notably identified the dimension of people's hearts and minds. To what extent are people across the board in Europe, citizens, to what extent are they ready to organize collective action that requires a kind of solidarity? There we might see less readiness rather than more readiness. And I agree with Erik that maybe the critical point at this juncture is indeed to try to assess the risks of initiatives being taken on that kind of dimension. Will it foster people's readiness to organize solidarity, or will it just exacerbate resistance? As a backdrop to that discussion, I would like to start by saying that at this very moment, the glass is half full, one might say, in terms of what European institutions have been doing vis-à-vis the corona crisis. And I would even say that the glass is half full in at least three senses, but simultaneously that raises the stakes. Let me explain very rapidly. First, in terms of policy initiatives that have been taken, I'm curious what Jonathan will tell us about political leadership, because I think that we should not expect high profile, let alone heroic political leadership from the European Commission or the Council President or the Parliament. That is not what we should expect. High profile political leadership is now tested at the national level. So if we assess what's been going on over the last 2 months on the basis of more realistic standards, more realistic expectations, I would say the record is not too bad. Obviously, on the backdrop of ECB action that has been very rapid and important, the PEPP and other actions by the ECB, but also on the level of the Commission, various proposals that have been tentatively accepted, the SURE program in support of short-time working arrangements. So very concrete steps. So that is something that is positively in the record. I would say that the glass is half full in a very different sense, but it might be important to keep that in mind. In contrast to, say, 2010, there is at the level of the thinking on how a national government should react to this crisis, there is by and large, I would say, broad consensus. Obviously, there are differences between the governments which people focus on in the sanitary approach, in the economic approach, but by and large, there is not a big divide on what a sensible domestic policy is. And that's in a sense an important asset. But simultaneously, obviously, that raises the stakes, because if you agree on what should be done, but then you say, well, everybody should do it for their own, then it's not because you have an intellectual disagreement on what should be done, but simply because you think people should do that, do their homework themselves. Let me add one thing and then I'll stop. Why do I think the glass is half full? Because yet the third element that makes me say that. Together with Teresa Kuhn and other people, we conducted large-scale research on how people think about cross-border solidarity. What comes out of that research is that there is a readiness to support cross-border solidarity initiatives. And that readiness is still there. Simultaneously, on the basis of very recent research we are doing, it seems that national electorates are more and more influenced by what their governments are telling in these situations, with the Germans and the Dutch becoming much more cautious. And a key element indeed, and I'll stop there, that's for the second round, the key element indeed is conditionality. If you want majority support, you need an element of conditionality in most of the countries. And I'm optimistic that a kind of constructive conditionality, a kind of forward-looking conditionality is feasible, is possible, but that will be the key issue. Wrapping up, the glass is half full, there is potential, but if the Commission now fails with what she announced today, if the Commission fails, it will be a high-profile failure. And there will not be an equilibrium with integration in some senses and disintegration in other senses. It will be disintegration.
Thank you, Frank. Since I'm unmuted, I'll give the word to Teresa. And yeah, I will say a word after you four have finished.
Thank you very much, Christina. Well, thanks for inviting me to talk here today. I think it's a very interesting moment to talk about the future of the EU, especially because there was such an important speech by Ursula von der Leyen today. And I think the past few months have really been historical in many different ways, but also really for the European Union. And Ursula von der Leyen today said that this is Europe's moment, and this is a very optimistic reading of how the last couple of months have actually developed. And it's also in stark contrast to an earlier speech by her at the beginning or end of March, where she herself, Ursula von der Leyen herself, admitted that the reactions by the member states have been rather painful from a European perspective, and that there were actually 27 individual responses rather than a joint response to the crisis. And in this perspective, it's first of all fascinating to see how she turned around in that respect and now came up with a bold proposal. And I think it's very good that she put forward such a proposal today, because I think not only Eurosceptics, but also Europhiles have been starting to wonder what is really the added value of the European Union. Because in the past couple of weeks or months, European ideals or things that the EU really stands for and that are usually also seen as legitimizing European institution building have been questioned in several ways. And this, in a way, also really questioned the added value or the purpose of the European Union. So I think there are a couple of narratives in which the EU has been kind of legitimized. And the first one is a narrative about democracy, about EU membership being a guarantee for democracy and for fulfilling the democratic rights. And here, this has been right away slashed back by Hungary installing some emergency rights that went as very far, so far that Timothy Garton-Ash recently said, okay, Hungary is actually not a democracy anymore. It's a dictatorship within the European Union. And I think a second narrative, if you say, okay, it's actually not democracy, but what is it then? Then, oh, it's actually economic prosperity through free movement and through the free market. So also this aspect has been challenged by member states in different ways. So first of all, that of course border controls were installed, or actually borders were closed very quickly. state aid. Erik just actually referred to it, so that some member states implemented large packages of state aid, which were very good for their own domestic industries, but were really against this idea of fair competition in an internal market. And then also we have to remember that, for example, Germany and France in the beginning even prohibited the export of PPE to other countries, which is of course also very much against the idea of free movement and the free market. So also this narrative about the EU of this internal market and economic prosperity has been challenged in the last couple of weeks. And then there are some people who probably say, yeah, but actually no, it's not. It's not about democracy. It's not about free movement. It's actually about standing together and showing solidarity. And also here, this narrative has been questioned quite hard from day one, because Italy was pretty much left alone in this crisis in the beginning. First with respect to asking for help in medical ways, also PPE, and then later, of course, economic help. And also here, Ursula von der Leyen referred to a fair weather union that only works with fair weather, but doesn't actually provide the umbrellas that you need. So I think in this respect, today's proposal is very timely because it partly answers some of, or provides some kind of reaction to these challenges. Not all of them, but at least some of them. And I think this is when we speak of the future of the European Union. If I had given this talk yesterday, I would have been much more negative and critical than today, because I think here the EU can actually also bring over not only Europhiles, but maybe also Eurosceptics, not because they truly believe in the EU, but because they want some action in this crisis, no matter where it comes from. And I will leave it at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to all four of you. I mean, we have had excellent presentations on this topic. I think what is now the aim is to lay links between your presentations rather than to fill on your presentation. So maybe I could prompt you with a few points before you get the word again. And one is, we have heard about the cleavages, both from Jonathan and from Erik. Erik, maybe more perception cleavages, if I may use that term to use the same. While we hear from Teresa that there's a distinction between Europhiles and Eurosceptics. So maybe I could prompt you to also think about not just cleavages between the countries, but also within them, and to what extent you recognize that, and what does it matter? Is it equally problematic? And I would also like to invite you to maybe reflect to an extent on the title of this session and the question. I mean, we have heard from Frank, the glass is half full, but to an extent, I at least read also the strict view on conditionality, or the focus on conditionality, as a level of mistrust that could, of course, is then in the eye of the beholder, whether the glass is half full or half empty. And I also think what is telling is that Teresa ended in saying that only one day earlier she would have been less optimistic, which is, of course, the question. I mean, to all these beautiful words, we now also need to see the action, and that it actually takes place and that it actually happens. So I think I will start with giving the words to our guest, then to Frank, then to Teresa, and then to Jonathan. Since Jonathan started, he will now be the last in this row, but I give Teresa a tiny moment to speak. So Erik, the floor is yours.
So, Christina, thank you so much for these questions. I think you really put your finger on it. And we used to talk in the Italian context, for example, about some fairly sharp distinctions between Eurosceptical and Europhilic political groups. I think Euroscepticism has gone fairly mainstream in Italy right now. And that's because of the perception of, as Teresa suggested, being abandoned at the start of the crisis. It's also because of perceptions that they'd been abandoned in previous crises. And it's because of the perception that the conditionality that's placed on them is not the same as the conditionality that was placed on other countries in banking resolution, for example. And so now there's a level of frustration, I think, that will be hard to overcome, even with a very generous proposal like this one. And so in that sense, I think we do have to be concerned. And there is the flip side, Christina, as you rightly point out, that there is a sense of mistrust, because when you listen to the rhetoric of politicians, and I think Dutch politicians have provided us with an unhealthy large volume of illustrations, when you listen to the rhetoric of politicians talking about giving money to Italy or to the Italian people, there is a very strong sense that the Italians need to prove that they're worthy of this gift in order to receive it. And that I think plays very badly in the Italian context, and I don't think Italy is alone in that respect.
Frank, yeah?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Christina, for the questions. On the cleavages, I have maybe a little bit the same reaction as Teresa has, and that's maybe because we've been conducting research on a number of these issues together. Yes, it is true that there are important cleavages, such as between Europhiles and Eurosceptics. On the other hand, that does not make it impossible, at least at the level of public opinion on which we do research. That does not make it impossible to find majority support for certain types of initiatives. And to give an example that comes out of the survey Teresa and I and Francesco Nicoli and Brian Burgoon conducted, there is this lady, I have a very specific case, in Belgium, who is an absolute Eurosceptic, who declares herself anti-EU. And when you ask her whether she thinks it's a good idea that the European Union should do something in support of countries that are hit by unemployment shocks, she says, yeah, given the conditions you attach to that, yes, that's a good idea. But I'm very much in favor of Marine Le Pen. So people they're not necessarily irrational in this. They are Eurosceptic, even anti-EU, but they might be supportive of some very concrete and tangible initiatives. And that's the window of opportunity, I would say. So I would second what Teresa said there. Secondly, on the conditionalities, that could be a long discussion. It's a very vague and ambiguous expression anyway to talk about conditionalities as such. However, I'm deeply convinced that you will not avoid conditionalities in one or other sense if you organize large-scale solidarity. Now, conditionalities can be simply pointing to areas of policy, like saying, with the ESM example, you should invest in healthcare, or you should remedy certain things that happen. That's one type of conditionality, which is delineation. The other type of conditionality is very constructive and forward-looking. We want investment in the digital economy, in the green economy. The more difficult conditionality is where you touch upon sensitive areas of policy, like, for instance, reform of labor markets. There, I think, is the real debate. To what extent can you indeed enforce upon countries certain recipes in terms of labor market policy or other so-called structural reform? There, I think we have to explain to policymakers that there's an important limitation there. But you have to come up with a certain notion of, I would say, reciprocity, conditionality, delineation, focus. Otherwise, you won't have robust majority support in most of the member states.
Thank you. But you also said that people listen more to their governments. So the question is also how this is portrayed.
Yes, and that's the reason, if I may, that's the reason why I think that we are at a risky juncture. That's what we see happen. The governments give a cue to how people think, like artists give a cue. And now governments give a cue. And you see how the German and the Dutch population start emphasizing more and more certain conditionalities, whilst the Italians dislike them more and more. And therefore, it's high time to find solutions on this. Therefore, this debate launched by the Recovery Initiative is indeed also timely. It's urgent.
Thank you, Frank. Teresa?
Thanks for your questions. I would like to react actually to both the question about cleavages within countries, and also whether the glass is half full and half empty, with actually one answer. I think what we're currently seeing, the kind of Euroscepticism that we're seeing, is very different to Euroscepticism in let's say normal times, but normal times in a way in the EU have been a long time ago. So let's say before the sovereign debt crisis, when I think a lot of people just thought that the EU was just meddling with too many things, was just getting into everybody's business where it shouldn't be, like the famous bananas that had to have a certain form. And so basically, I think a lot of Eurosceptics basically did not want the EU to do so much. And I think now we see a Euroscepticism that is just the opposite, that they say, hey, the EU is actually not doing anything. So I think here you can actually get a majority by Eurosceptics and Europhiles by actually coming up with a bold proposal of European action. And of course, there are clear differences with respect to, for example, cross-country redistribution or transfers. But I think in times of crisis like now, even people who are usually Eurosceptic are in favor of some action, no matter where it's actually coming from. And this also brings me to my second point. I do think that this is a moment where leadership can make a difference. As Frank just mentioned, there are, people react to cues. And I think so for example, the reaction by Rutte and other Dutch politicians was certainly not helpful. And I think if they actually would start to tell a different story, then actually there could also be here a change in public opinion.
Thank you. As a lawyer, I must immediately think, but there's a limit to competence as well. I mean, people want the EU to stand for democracy and influence countries that, as you have rightly pointed out, are called autocratic. I wonder how much disappointment will follow when we realize that the EU has very limited competence, much less than on the banana issue. Jonathan, I give the word to you, but before I do, I would like to remind the audience that after Jonathan speaks in this round, we will open the floor to questions and answers. And I just would like to remind you, if you have a question, please type it into the question and answer field. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks to the other panelists. I'd like to make 3 quick points in reaction. One concerns what's at stake in the EU's response to the crisis and the success or failure of the proposals that have been made by the Commission today. I think that the EU is, as polities go, unusually dependent for people's attitudes towards it on whether it is seen to be performing successfully or not. And we saw in response both to the Euro crisis and to the refugee crisis an initial catastrophic fall across many countries in support for the EU, which was gradually restabilized as the measures that were taken seemed to address the most urgent issues of the crisis. And an optimistic view would be that if these proposals are now successful, that will be the narrative and public perception that comes out of the crisis. The second point that I wanted to make does concern leadership. And here I agree with what has been said, especially in the sense that the key leadership roles are not so much at the European level, although we may think that von der Leyen's package is an intelligent one, but at the national level. And what there is critical is whether national leaders are willing to explain to their publics what is at stake also for them in collective solutions to the cross-border problems raised, for example, by the pandemic, or whether they try to stick to national red lines and watch mainly their positioning with their domestic political rivals. And here, what is very striking, and I think probably more important than the package von der Leyen put together, is the change of position that Angela Merkel made about mutualization, even on a temporary basis, of debts, which has laid the foundation for the Commission's proposal. And what's clear is that she sees the stake that Germany as a whole and the German economy and German business has in the single market. And of course, in that respect, it is surprising that Dutch politicians, or at least the Dutch Prime Minister and Finance Minister, have not taken that sort of view. And what will be interesting to see, first of all, is whether they're willing to accept face-saving compromises, and secondly, to the extent that they are not, whether there will be pressure from domestic business interests, but also from the center-left parties, which have already started to challenge the stance of the Prime Minister, including the D66 party in his own coalition. So it may be that where leadership is lacking, domestic interests and opposition parties can play a catalytic role. We'll see.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I have a question from the audience, which I actually have difficulties to put to any specific person of the panelists. So I will just throw it out and you will be able to grab it if you like. Because the claim or the point going forward is a question from a worried US European citizen, Catherine Geizan. And she says that she attended all the sessions of the Virtual Visions for Europe, and that last week Professor Gardner argued, in her view correctly, that the fate of multilateralism rests on the actively engaged EU in the world, whether it's in the Middle East, in the neighborhood, or Iran, climate change, and so forth. The US has turned away from multilateral engagements, and even with a new president, she believes that the Trumpian presidency will have long-term consequences. So we cannot count on China or India or Russia to step in, is her point. And what's the role of the EU? Is it further disempowered by this pandemic? So I invite the panelists to also take a position on the role of the EU in the world as a consequence of the pandemic. And maybe you raise your hand if you feel the question is directed to you. Jonathan?
I mean, the question is not directed to me, but having watched last week's session, I did have some thoughts. And one is that the EU, although it presents itself as a strong defender of so-called effective multilateralism, the EU is often, in my view, most effective when it acts unilaterally and bilaterally. That has been the tendency of the past 10 years, and the strength and attractiveness of the European market and European regulation is a very powerful lever for EU external action, and can also be used to support multilateralism, for example, in issues like fighting deforestation. So I think we should be, less worried in a sense that the EU can only operate in a multilateral way and will be inherently disadvantaged. It can play a role in putting back together a new and perhaps more effective kind of multilateral order insofar as it gets partners elsewhere, perhaps in a post-Trump United States.
Anyone else from the panelists who would come, like Erik?
So I think this is, Catherine, I think this is an exceptional question. And when you look at the Franco-German agreement that set the stage for the proposal that the Commission just came out with, everybody focuses on point number 2 in the agreement, which is the point about the recovery fund. But point number 1 is about creating some kind of European sovereignty in the health domain. Point number 3 is about creating strategic autonomy in terms of green technology and digital technology. And point number 4 is about building more resilient supply chains, which we should all hear is about building supply chains that are more locally oriented. And what these 3 points together imply is a Europe that's trying to contract its economy in a way that makes it much more under the control of the European Union in ways that make it more resilient, more effective, more powerful. There's also at the bottom of point number 2, a tax component that says we should probably be taxing these digital firms more aggressively to fund our resources. Now, if you add those points together, I think that actually spells trouble for the multilateral economy, because it's going to be hard for the multilateral economy to accommodate a Europe that has an active industrial policy in that way. And I would note, when the 4 smaller countries came out with their counter proposal, that was the only overlap in the Venn diagram. They have a sentence at the bottom of their counter proposal that says, we want to have a more active European industrial policy. And a final point on that. This crisis is going to draw the public sector more deeply into the private sector than it has been since the end of the Second World War, even in countries that don't normally do that kind of a thing. And that's not just a distortion of competition rules and state aid policy in Europe, that's a distortion of the way competition rules and state aid policies are structured at the global level as well. And getting these countries out of that posture is going to be a long-term endeavor. And I think by the end of it, we're going to have a very different global trading regime as a result.
Thank you, Erik. I think we have a question that follows very nicely up on that by Yazid Zada, and that's a second question. The role of the state has taken an important, the state has taken an important role in tackling the repercussions of COVID-19, while the EU has become sidelined. To what extent do you believe that the not yet approved recovery plan will lead to a more active state intervention in the market? But let me immediately pose also her second question. So again, all panelists can think whether they want to take one of the 2 up. To what extent will the recovery plan create more cleavages among the member states who oppose mutualization of debt and now with the conditionalities? So I think the first, well, my now secondly read out question goes mainly to Jonathan, maybe to an extent to Erik, but maybe Erik, you want to come in on the second question. So the one I read out first. Sorry for the confusion.
So the state is going to come in a massive way, but here I think that it's important to bear in mind the state can only come in a massive way for particular types of firms. For small and medium-sized enterprises engaged in the service sector and for firms engaged in tourism, it's almost impossible for the state to intervene effectively. So those economies that have a large industrial base are going to have more effective state intervention, and they're going to emerge much more quickly and much more strongly from the crisis. Those economies that depend on tourism are going to be devastated, unfortunately, because they're going to lose a whole tourist season, and it's going to be very difficult to recapitalize those industries. So it's going to take some real creative thinking. And I think along the way, what we're going to see is an increasing divergence in macroeconomic terms across the European Union.
Thanks. Do you want to come in on the question I read out second, Jonathan? Shall I recap? The question, to what extent we have cleavages are broadened or deepened between those who oppose mutualization of debt and those subjects to conditionalities?
Well, I would say 2 things. First, I would actually also like to comment on the first part of the question that we were just discussing. And I mean, I am struck by, in a way, the continuing vagueness of the proposals for a new and more interventionist European industrial policy. I mean, it's relatively easy to see what that might amount to, for example, for certain kinds of pharmaceuticals, for medical supplies, for things that are really directly related to public health. But it's much more difficult to understand what exactly it's going to mean, for example, to changes in competition policy. I mean, studies of European merger and state aid policy, find typically that the Commission prohibits very few mergers. So I wonder whether this is not more symbolic for now or aspirational than worked out, and therefore how much difference it's going to make in the longer term. As regards the cleavages over mutualization of debt, I think that will depend very much on how national political leaders and national elites pose the issues vis-a-vis their publics. It is possible, if they dig in their heels, it will lead to new and perhaps more intense cleavages, but it is possible that it may redraw or blur those cleavages if satisfactory solutions are found. But on the question of, I do think that conditionality is both a very difficult term, very charged term, and also difficult to carry forward. If it were possible to reframe conditionalities as forms of reciprocity, that might be indeed much more helpful. But if we think about the history of conditionality on fiscal policy, that is not very encouraging that it can be made to work. And if it can't be made to work on fiscal policy, one can ask whether it can be made to work on other areas like labor market policy that Frank mentioned earlier.
Thank you. I think it is time to have a question for Teresa and Frank. And Maurits asks that he's intrigued by the idea that there are proposals that would get majority support by bringing some Eurosceptics into the fold. He can imagine that this is the case within a single EU member state, but is it also true EU-wide? In other words, are there proposals that would get majority support in every single EU country? If so, what would such a proposal look like? And he gives a sense that Euroscepticism is too different in the different member states. I think I will first turn to Teresa maybe, and then give Frank the word.
Thank you, thanks. Yeah, that's a very good question. And it actually relates to a study that Frank and I conducted also together with Francesco Nicoli and Brian Burgoon on European unemployment insurance risk sharing. So that's actually not something that was really on the table today, but there we actually were surprised to see that there is actually room for maneuver for policymakers to come up with policy proposals, looking, well-designed policies that actually find support, majority support across member states. And it was really interesting to see that there was actually strong agreement across member states how such a policy should actually look like. And the issue the dimension where there was least agreement was actually cross-country redistribution, not surprisingly. So here it was actually more difficult, but also there, if you link it, and again, I'm saying the word conditionality, if you link it to conditions, both at the national level and at the European level, you could also convince people that were generally more skeptical. And another way I think to think of here is also to think of, for example, the cap. Farmers have never really been like the most,
The common agriculture policy, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. The common so support for farmers basically, and this could also convince farmers who were maybe usually not the most pro-Europeans to actually support these policies simply because they were themselves actually benefiting from them. So I think if you find good ways also to target Eurosceptics in some way, then this might be possible. But I give the word to Frank now.
Yeah, I would counsel Moritz, who is the person who asks that question about the feasibility of such policies. I would say, have a look at the report we published on this large-scale survey. You find that report at the AISSR website or my own website, and Teresa published a paper in the Journal of Common Market Studies and a paper in JEP on it. Basically, you indeed see that Euroscepticism has traction. You see that people who identify less with the EU, people who have less trust in the EU, they tend to be very sensitive to certain variants on certain dimensions. True. But that does not make it impossible to find majority support in all the countries concerned for other variants. And so very much depends on the exact design of solidarity. And that is what we studied. So we wanted to move beyond very general discussions and very open-ended questions on solidarity, where people simply react on the basis of their gut feeling. What we wanted to do is to move beyond that kind of research and table very, very concrete but very variegated policies to people and see how they react on the specificity of a design of solidarity. And then you see indeed that you can have majority support both in northern countries, in countries like Germany and the Netherlands, in countries like Italy and Spain, in France. You can have majority support depending on how you organize it. And to come back to the example I've given in my previous intervention, that's really an example from that survey, because we also had open questions where people could simply say what they wanted to say or shout what they wanted to shout to us. And you see that people can really be in two minds. They can be anti-EU and nevertheless very positively surprised by a specific design of solidarity and say, well, that's not a bad idea. I could support that. And that is interesting. But obviously, as already has been said by other people, it all depends on the framing of such proposals. And their political leadership is key. It's how you frame the issue, how you bring it to the table, how you bring it into people's personal living context. That's what came out of that research. But that is, in a sense, on the one hand, encouraging. On the other hand, it signals, it underscores the absolutely key responsibility there is with political leaders on how they frame such questions.
Would you have a hunch for us, Frank, why people, in your view, listen more to their government now than previously? Because it seems almost surprising in the era of fake news and general mistrust in institutions. Is this a consequence of the pandemic?
My immediate guess, I have an immediate guess, but it's absolutely speculation. One is that people like Rutte in the Netherlands, or Merkel in Germany, or Macron in France, obviously, they have now a lot of leverage vis-à-vis public opinion. Trust in those people, or let's say the followership of those people is increasing. So they do have more impact than they normally have. They are followed. People watch them. And so if they say something about the EU, it's also watched and followed. That's one. Secondly, I'm afraid that there is also an element of repetition and learning. If someone like Rutte repeats time and again in any context, be it the financial crisis or be it COVID-19, that all member states should first do their own homework, they should first do their homework, they should first do their homework. There's an element of repetition there. And I'm afraid that that kind of repetition is working, which is not encouraging them. But that's my guesstimate on what is happening.
Thank you. Let's turn to 3 more questions that I think we can group together, or one is more a comment. 2 questions by Sonia asking, will and should the EU save multilateralism? So again, a question directed to the external side of the EU. And her second question is, will the EU pick a side in the coming China-US conflict, or will it try to stay in the middle? And Catherine came back, and I think to an extent that is related, that she's not primarily worried about the EU itself, so questioning maybe with how existential the pandemic is, but rather about the non-violent conflict resolution in the world, and to what extent that comes under pressure if the EU does not save multilateralism. So again, 2 questions to the outside, and I will just put them out there for grabs. Erik?
Yeah, let me do the China piece, because I think this is interesting. I don't think that there is a situation under the current administration in the United States that the European Union is going to line up with that administration against China. So if that's the question, then the answer is no, that's not going to happen. The real issue is whether Europe is going to have a different fight with China. And here I'll go back to the original Franco-German proposal. And in that original Franco-German proposal, there's a very interesting line about stricter scrutiny on direct foreign investment. And that stricter scrutiny on direct foreign investment, which means external investment coming into the European Union, is almost surely targeted at China. It's also targeted at the United States, but the targeting at China, I think, is important. And we've already seen China begin to push back on that. Now, what's interesting about that is that that also creates a conflict within the European Union, because there's a significant part of the European Union, both in the countries in Central and Eastern Europe and in Italy, that have signed up to these kinds of relationships with China that are going to be increasingly strained by this policy, if indeed it does get adopted. And so I think that's what we should look at. And that reflects back on whether the European Union is going to be a unilateralist actor, which was Jonathan's point earlier, or whether it's going to be some kind of a savior of the multilateral system. I think the former is more likely. The more unilateralist posture seems to me to be easier for me to imagine, particularly vis-a-vis China.
Maybe you want to come in, Jonathan? Oh no, I see Teresa, sorry. I'll first give the word to Teresa then.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to react to the question about basically the EU's role in dealing with non-violent conflict, or dealing with conflict resolution, let's put it like this. I think what is interesting is that in the multi-annual financial framework, the budget for European common defense is much smaller than originally anticipated. So I think it went down from 13 billion euro to 8, and that's of course a significant difference. And I think here we just see that there was some kind of growing interest in European defense, and this has now kind of been sidelined by the pandemic. And in a similar way, if we remember at the beginning of the crisis, a big question was, a big concern was basically a new inflow of migrants coming to the EU, and the whole situation at the EU's borders. And this has, I think, completely being erased from public perception at the moment. So I think this crisis is clearly just turning everybody inwards and letting people forget what's actually happening outside. So in that respect, I share your worries, let's put it like this. Thanks.
Jonathan, do you want to come in and react to the multilateral and unilateralism point, or I have one more, sorry, before I give you the word, I would like to remind the audience, you can still put questions out there. it is still possible. We have some time left.
Thanks. So I did want to come back to the multilateralism point. I think one way to square the circle between unilateralism and multilateralism is with the concept that Joanne Scott, who is a legal scholar based at EUI, has coined, which is contingent. The EU is a contingent unilateralist. And I think there's a lot to that in many cases, the EU continues to support multilateral goals and framework, but in the context of dysfunctionalities of those institutions is prepared to take action itself in order to advance multilateral goals. Things like the forest law enforcement, governance, and trade initiative to combat illegal logging, or also the proposals for a carbon border tax. I mean, there, the idea of those kinds of measures is to put pressure on other countries to contribute to achieving multilateral goals. And you know, as with proposals for including other countries in emission trading obligations, if they have their own system that works equivalently, or if, say, for aviation, the International Civil Aviation Organization comes up with effective proposals to address the problem, then the EU will suspend or not apply its unilateral measures. So that is one of the ways in which EU unilateralism and multilateralism can fit together. On the question of China that Erik was discussing, I mean, it is interesting that the EU has some similar criticisms of China in terms of handling of intellectual property and obstacles for European firms operating in the Chinese market. But if they do indeed go down the road of having their own more protectionist approach to the European market, then that line of argument pursued through the WTO could be expected to drop away. So it's not very clear how this will play out.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have limited time left, but at the moment, no open questions from the audience. So I would like to invite you, to each of you, to take a minute to go back to our starting question, whither the EU, so that you, I mean, many of you have given us indications, glass half full, integration and disintegration always come together. But to what extent do you think, Jonathan called it an existential crisis, to what extent, where do you think, in what way will the EU fundamentally be different after the pandemic? So not how are we dealing with it, but what will really, where are we going? How is this different from here on? The order of appearance, maybe, I don't know. Maybe I give Teresa you the word first, and then Frank, Erik, and Jonathan.
Oh, it's very difficult to how is the EU going to be fundamentally different? I have a very spontaneous answer to that question, but that actually has nothing to do with the big questions asked here, but something that relates more to my previous research on transnationalism, and that European identity is actually forged through cross-border interactions and communication. And I've been asking myself a lot, what does the pandemic and what does social distancing and restrictions on mobility have to do, or what is that going to mean for European identity, and generally more this we feeling that scholars have referred to, and not only at the citizen level, but also at the level of political leaders. So I've read some interesting commentary that one reason why the negotiations between the member states have been so difficult was actually because they were not physical meetings in Brussels with, you know, a dinner before and some nice chats afterwards, and, you know, all the things that usually belong to such council meetings, but that everybody was in their in their own room and just communicating via Zoom, which is much more difficult to basically come up with, you know, side discussions, etc. So I think this is a really interesting question, where I think we will see a different way of communication and interaction for the next year, even when the crisis, you know, when the pandemic as such is maybe over, but we still have to do the social distancing.
Thank you. Frank? 1 minute.
Yes, my answer to whether the EU is that it very much depends on what will happen with today's initiative. If today's initiative leads to a political compromise in which not too much political capital is lost in terms of further divergence in the hearts and minds of Europeans across European countries, so if it is a political compromise that does not lead to an enormous erosion of political capital by the fight that was necessary, then I think the EU's capacity for collective action will be enhanced. Not dramatically, but it will have been enhanced. On the contrary, if we see a political compromise or a process that leads to very bitter disputes and further divergence in the hearts and minds of citizens across European countries, then I think the capacity for further collective action will be really diminished.
Thank you, Frank. Erik?
So I've spent much of the last 6 weeks writing scenarios that unfold over 12, 24, and 36 months. And what I came away from that exercise was with 3 observations. The first is that we are much better off in Europe right now having the European Union than we would be if we did not have it. The second is that I don't see how, if we didn't have the European Union right now, in this political climate, there would be any inclination or opportunity to create it. And so the third is, following on what Frank said, we cannot afford to break the European Union right now. So rather than predict what's going to happen in the future, what I would say is the stakes here are vital. The reason for having this kind of conversation is everybody needs to focus their attention on how to protect this institutional arrangement, because the alternative would be very, 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 very unpleasant for everybody in Europe.
Thank you, Erik. Jonathan, you have the last word.
Well, I mean, in some ways, it's an easy last word, because I very much agree with what all 3 of the speakers have just said. I guess I'm struck not only by the intensity of the stakes at issue, which Erik has just underlined, but by the strength of functional interdependence within Europe that pushes towards these compromises. Now that, of course, doesn't mean that because there are strong incentives for people to strike compromises, and because it is apparent to many people that a failure to reach a viable compromise would have very disastrous consequences, that people will succeed. And we have to remember what happened in 1914, when also functional interdependencies were very high, but where national leaders did not rise to the occasion and allowed an integrated European economy and set of relations between then independent nation states to collapse, in that case, into war. So it can happen, but I am encouraged by the intensity of the pressures to find a solution. I'm optimistic that we will find a solution which will look, something like the proposal we've seen today. Erik has famously talked about intergovernmental agreements as a form of failing forwards, so that they're suboptimal compromises that leave the need for further action in the future. I'm optimistic in the glass half full perspective that the EU and its national leaders can succeed forward step by step, even if they don't solve all the problems at one fell swoop, which is of course impossible.
Thank you very much. And thanks again to Erik Jones, our true guest, Frank van den Broek, Teresa Kuhn, and Jonathan Zeitlin for the interesting discussion, and of course the public for their questions. And with this other thought-provoking session, I would like to end the virtual vision for Europe for today.
Could we just also thank our hosts, Lisa Saris, technical host, and also our colleagues from SPUI25 and Gijs van der Starre, the managing director of ACES, all of without whom we couldn't have done this. So, and thanks to you, the audience, some of you who've faithfully listened to us and asked questions over 5 weeks. And we certainly hope to be seeing some of you face to face, but many of you online in the months to come.